Alabama because by law, she knew she had every right to that seat. The NAACP was inspired by Colvin's bravery and decided to do the same with another person. However, the NAACP did not publicize her Define Act because they thought she was too young and she could have gotten into a great deal of trouble, which was true. Many of the women who refused even before Colvin had been married outside of wedlock or had previous arrest records, and the NAACP was afraid to use them because they were not, quote, the perfect victims. Rosa Parks came as an easier choice to the NAACP because her record was clean. Thus, condemning Parks would have been harder than exploiting the personal histories of the other girls. Parks employed herself to refuse a white person a seat on the bus in what the NAACP would be a, quote, test case or example case that the organization could later use to exemplify and expose the treatment blacks faced. Parks' refusal to get up was a design of the NAACP to hopefully bring attention to how unjust segregation was and to incite change.
Abbeville, Alabama, September 3rd, 1944. Reese Taylor was walking home from a church service when a green Chevrolet of 6 white men cornered her. As Taylor began to run, one of the men grabbed her, forced her into the car, and she was driven through the woods. Here, Taylor was brutally gang raped, blindfolded, and left on the side of a deserted road. Reese Taylor was a 24-year-old African-American mother and sharecropper at the time. Quote, after they messed over and did what they were going to do to me, they say, we're going to take you back. We're going to put you out. But if you tell it, we're going to kill you, end quote. Taylor recalled in an interview in 2011 when she was 91. Taylor's father, who found his daughter along the highway at around 3 a.m., reported the assault with his daughter to the local county sheriff. Taylor's friend, who had witnessed the abduction, had already reported the kidnapping. One of the men confessed to the rape and named the 6 other men involved. Yet the local police did absolutely nothing, and none of the men were arrested. A few days after the rape, the NAACP found out about the gang rape and sent one of their best investigators, Rosa Parks, to find out why no one had been arrested. Parks, sparked by her own experiences with sexual assault, rallied support for the indictment of the men. By October of 1944, Taylor's rape made headlines across the country. Despite their efforts, a grand jury refused to indict the men. The defendants even wanted and offered to pay $100 each to make Taylor forget. Rosa Parks sent a letter to the governor of Alabama and urged others to send letters demanding equal justice for Reese Taylor. After the surge of letters, the governor ordered another investigation of the rape, but a second grand jury refused to indict the men for the second time, and the men were never punished to this day. Cases like Reese Taylor's were not uncommon, but they were rarely ever publicized and given the attention that Taylor's case was given. Taylor, who died a month ago at age 97, did not stay silent and fought for her justice that Alabama's justice system refused to give her. Oprah mentioned Reese Taylor in her speech at the Golden Globes for a reason, but left out key details. Reese Taylor's persistency and her voice symbolize the racial injustice and sexual violence that Black women face across the country today, and helped spark the overlooked mass movement against sexual violence and racism that transpired in the 1940s.
Okay, raise your hand if you've heard of the Me Too movement. Keep your hand up if you know who Tarana Burke is. Okay, as most of you know, last October began a social media movement unified by the hashtag #MeToo. It all started when actress Alyssa Milano tweeted that women who have been sexually assaulted or harassed should post a status saying "Me Too" to give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. The hashtag, of course, exploded on social media with more than 12 million posts and reactions on Facebook in just the first 24 hours. What most people don't know, however, is that Alyssa Milano did not come up with the idea. The phrase was actually coined more than 10 years ago by a woman named Tarana Burke, a Black civil rights activist. Tarana Burke grew up in New York, and her activism started in 1997 when she was a camp director. a young girl asked to speak to her privately and proceeded to disclose that her mother's boyfriend was molesting her. Burke froze in the moment. She sent the girl off to a different counselor. Reflecting later, she said, quote, "I watched her put her mask back on and go back into the world like she was all alone, and I couldn't even bring myself to whisper, 'Me too.'" Regretting how she acted in that situation, she decided to attempt to make a larger change. 10 years later, Burke founded an organization called Just Be with the goal of supporting underprivileged women of color, particularly those affected by sexual harassment and assault. One of the organization's main programs is called Me Too, after what Burke wishes she could have said in that moment with that little girl. Fast forwarding to now, Burke is grateful that the notion of allying together to stop sexual assault has gotten so much press. However, there are key differences that separate her intentions from what Me Too has become today. While today's movement is about holding high-profile perpetrators responsible for their actions, she intended to, quote, "support Black and brown women and girls across the country." Burke has rarely been credited for her founding role in the movement. Most notably, Burke was not featured on the cover of Time magazine when the 2017 Person of the Year were the Silence Breakers. Alyssa Milano did acknowledge Burke when she realized the connection, and the two have been working together ever since. Unfortunately, the initial oversight and disrespect of a trailblazing Black woman is too commonplace, and another moment the feminist movement failed to include women of color. It is important for us to learn from this and work to support the too often ignored women of color that also fall victim to sexual assault. The challenge for Burke now is translating the powerful online movement to real life. When asked about her goals for 2018, she says she plans to help train, guide, and help people on being active in their communities. She plans to fight for better background checks for school employees, to write guides for families and professionals taking assault disclosures, and to find tangible ways to support survivors. As for us, I hope learning about Tarana Burke reminds us that we need to uplift the voices of people of color in our community, because they are too often silenced. We cannot be content with whitewashed feminism. We need to learn about, listen to, and support women of color, specifically their experiences with sexual harassment and assault. Lastly, I hope we've learned to appreciate women like Tarana Burke, who are helping to change the world and receiving little credit. Thank you.
Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King was born on April 27, 1927, to a working-class family in High Burger, Alabama. She was an author, activist, civil rights leader, and singer. But like many Black women, her life's work has been overshadowed by her husband's recognition, and it is an incredible disservice to her when she is simply recognized as Dr. King's wife. She first became politically active while at Antioch College in Ohio. She joined their chapter of the NAACP, was a member of the Race Relations and Civil Liberties Committee, and fought against discrimination within the local school board. Her advocacy continued post-college by fighting for civil rights legislation and awareness. She used her love of singing as a form of advocacy when she changed the lyrics of her songs to tell the story of the Montgomery bus boycott while performing at a concert. She urged the civil rights movement to include women, the LGBTQ community, economic issues, world peace, and various other causes as a call for intersectionality. An example of her intersectional advocacy is evident when she helped organize the Women's Strike for Peace protest in January 1968 and co-chaired the Congress of Women Conference, calling for women to unite and form a solid block of women power to fight the three great evils of racism, poverty, and war. In remembrance of her late husband, she also founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, serving as a president and CEO and founding the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, now titled Peace Action, in 1957.
During the South African apartheid, she participated in sit-in protests in DC and went on a 10-day trip to South Africa to meet with Winnie Mandela and Alain Bosak, the UDF leaders, to see how she could assist and what she could bring back to the United States. She fought for equality even in her later years, giving lectures at universities on the history of the civil rights movement, publicly denouncing her support for the U.S. missile attack on Iraq, and commending officials like Director William Sessions for his leadership in bringing women and minorities into the FBI. In 1995, she attempted to chair an event to register 1 million African American women voters. In 2003, at the 13th Annual Creating Change Conference organized by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, she linked the civil rights movement to the LGBT rights movement by reminding audiences that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. She also invited the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to take part in the 40th anniversary of the March on Washington, the first time an LGBT rights group was invited to a major event of the African American community. King died on February 7, 2006. She was posthumously awarded the Gandhi Peace Prize by the Government of India, along with numerous other honors. Coretta Scott King was so much more than Dr. King's wife. She was an advocate for the people and should be properly remembered as one of the forefront leaders during the civil rights movement.
I want to start with a quote from Elaine Brown's autobiography, A Taste of Power, A Black Woman's Story. A woman in the Black Power movement was considered, at best, irrelevant. A woman asserting herself as a pariah. If a Black woman assumed a role of leadership, she was said to be eroding Black manhood, to be hindering the progress of the Black race. She was an enemy to the Black people. I knew I had to muster something mighty to manage the Black Panther Party. Elaine Brown is an activist, writer, singer, and the only female chairperson to have ever led the Black Panther Party. Born in heavily impoverished North Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1943, Brown attended a predominantly white experimental elementary school where she saw her childhood starkly divided between the comforts of schooling and the realities of her home life. Following her high school graduation, Brown attended Temple University for 1 year before leaving for Los Angeles. While working, she became acquainted with Jay Kennedy, to whom she credits her early political education and introduction to the Black Panther Party. Soon, she began writing for the Black Congress newspaper, Harambee. Before the end of April 1968, following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Brown attended her first Panther Party meeting. Though the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense continues to appear with negative associations of militancy and violence, it was in fact a revolutionary socialist group. As Brown put it, being a Black Panther meant surrendering our lives to something greater, with the notion of getting rid of oppression. As a member, she helped establish the party's first free breakfast for children program, became editor of the party paper, became elected the first female member of the Panther Central Committee, and ran for Oakland City Council. Through this all, she faced the difficulties of her intersecting identities as a Black woman in a male-dominated party. In her own words, the value of my life had been obliterated as much by being female as by being Black and poor. Racism and sexism in America were equal partners in my oppression. When the party's founder, Huey Newton, fled to Cuba in 1974 and she solidified her leadership position, she worked to redefine the Panthers' revolutionary program to include the aspirations of Black women. Her leadership and participation ended in 1977 with Newton's return and the rising resentment of her leadership in the party. Brown moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where she established Field of Flowers, a nonprofit organization designed to build a model education center for impoverished children. Brown also co-founded 2 other organizations, Mothers Advocating Juvenile Justice in 1997 and the National Alliance for Radical Prison Reform in 2002. She remains active in prison and education reform as well as juvenile justice. Thank you.
Fran Sanders is an artist who graduated from the Pratt Institute. She contributed to the anthology The Black Woman, an anthology, edited by Toni Cade Bambara in the 1970s. These writings express the feelings and experiences of many Black women who were marginalized during the Black freedom movement. Throughout history, Black women have struggled to navigate their racial and gender identities. Often, they've had to choose between whether to focus on issues affecting women or advocate for the enfranchisement of Blacks. However, their roles became minimized in both social movements because of the sexism in civil rights and the racism in women's rights movements. As a result, Black women express their frustrations under their own umbrella of Black feminism, which is a tool for understanding the impact of a Black woman's identity in society. Alice Walker coined the term womanist as a branch of feminism specifically for Black women. The term refers to the racist and classist aspects of white feminism, which excluded women of color. Womanism encompasses the relationship between Black women and men as different to how white women would connect with Black men. It also speaks to Black women's support towards their men, although sometimes experiencing sexual violence from them. Sanders wrote an essay titled Dear Black Man, which addresses Black feminism and interpersonal relationships of Black men and women. For years, Hollywood often depicted the relationship between Black men and women as more of a mother-boy relationship than that of a mate. The women were strong and independent, meanwhile the men were portrayed as fearful and seeking her guidance. These images resulted in the resentment of the Black matriarch. Black men believed the assumptions perpetuated by white men of what masculinity looks like, control over the women and children. Sanders writes in her essay, "She deballed the Black man. Now let's face it, it was she who caused the race to survive. And if we are now all finally finding our voices to assert ourselves as a race, let it not be at her expense." Black women were not conditioned in the same way as white women to remain at home because during slavery they would work alongside Black men. After emancipation, having no money, it was necessary for both men and women to work. However, Black men were accused of minimal, often silly crimes and pushed into the convict leasing system, leaving many Black women alone to take care of their children. This was another way whites exploited Black labor, breaking up their families, but then twisting the story to blame Black women. Later in the essay, Sanders writes about the hostile approach of Black men who address women while using terms such as soul sister. She argues that it is a calculated response as though, quote, to exploit any guilty feelings we as Black women may have about not being understanding enough with our men. Black men throughout history have felt emasculated in their inability to provide for their families. During slavery, they were forced to obey white men who claimed ownership over them, and their families were often separated. Following emancipation, Black men were restricted from acquiring jobs in competition with white men. Often they were targets of white fun, from mockery to extreme measures such as lynching. As a result, Sanders believes that Black women and children bear the frustrations of Black men who endure daily discrimination. In this way, some men expect women that they acknowledge to reciprocate those actions with their attention. However, Black women are not required to talk to every guy that may speak to them. During the same soul sister encounter, the man threatened to get a gun and shoot her if she ever came back that way and didn't speak to him. If the gentleman was trying to make a pass at Sanders, he did so more aggressively than necessary. While she was shocked, Sanders did not report the man for the threat. Although a relatively small offense, unfortunately there are Black women in abusive relationships. Sanders writes, "One should hardly have to be called to the task on the base of racial tie to suffer the indignities and insults that would send another Black woman searching frantically for the nearest policeman. Due to issues of mass incarceration of Black men to single mother or mostly female households, some Black women will not report abusive behavior for the sake of their race. Even witnesses may choose not to help for this reason." Sanders concludes her essay with these lines, "Talk to me like I'm the woman that I am, and not to me as the woman who is an animate creation of someone's overactive imagination. If you love me, tell me so. Don't approach me as you would an enemy. I am on your side and always have been." Amidst the daily discriminations Black men have faced in society, Black women have always stood with them. Ida B. Wells led anti-lynching campaign. Women in the Black Panther Party advocated for the release of political prisoners. Black women do not need to prove their love towards their men because they have already done so countless times. Black women are not the problem. Rather, it is the racist and patriarchal society they live in. Thank you.
Sorry.